Today we're going to look through every army in 40k and what I think are the strongest units for each one. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where today we're doing an updated video for the strongest unit for every faction in the game. I made one of these around 8 months back towards the start of 9th edition, and now with the amount of codexes that have dropped, points cost that have changed, and in general the way that 9th edition missions are played now, I feel that the list has changed quite a bit. With that in mind, we'll go through each faction in turn, talk about the unit that I feel might be the single strongest, and then just go through a bunch of the other different contenders that I think could easily be argued as to be the top pick. Obviously just picking one unit is a little bit arbitrary. It's kind of impossible to compare buffing units to direct damage dealers to units that are really great for objectives and scoring. It's still fun to talk through though, and maybe share a little bit of reasoning as to why I picked what I did. If you're interested as well, I also made a video like this for the weakest units for each army, so feel free to give that a search if you'd like to. In any case, let's crack on, and we'll start with the Space Marines and the units from each chapter. So for the Space Marines, with their enormous unit pool, there's lots of good options, and since they got a few nerfs to some of their best units in chapter approved, I think it's quite hard to pick one as a standout. In the end, I decided to go with the Incursor squad, as I just feel like they're very rarely ever going to be a wrong choice in a Space Marine list, a nice durable troops choice that you can plonk straight on the midfield objectives, and they can be very hardy to enemy firepower, getting transhuman physiology if they need it, and also using smokescreen to make them -1 to hit. They can help screen out the enemy doing pre-game movement shenanigans, and potentially in some melee chapters even pack a real punch in combat if they do want to do a first turn charge. Often they'll die quite quickly, but that's kind of fine, as if they're doing the dying then hopefully other things in the army aren't. Really though, there's all sorts of other options that I could have happily put at the top spot for Space Marines. We all know what Eradicators do, some of the strongest anti-tank in the game as it stands, their double shooting ability being able to melt tanks with ease. Blade Guard veterans are both incredibly tough with those storm shields and transhuman physiology, and have a great flurry of high strength, high AP, high damage attacks. Vanguard veterans are sort of like a more mobile option, particularly when equipped with lightning claws and storm shields, but they did get hit by a 2-point nerf in chapter approved with that loadout. The Redemptor Dreadnought is both core, so gets some nice rerolls, as well as being a really solid vehicle both at range and in melee. Attack bikes took a 5-point nerf in chapter approved, but are basically like Eradicators if you just want a little bit less firepower, but a lot more mobility. The Volkite Contemptor Dreadnought, which I made an entire video on the other day, just slogs out a decent amount of firepower, and again is core for some rerolls. The Primaris Chaplain on bike is perhaps one of the most popular HQ choices, delivering very powerful litanies exactly where they're needed, and being very fast and able to mix it up in combat too. Finally, last but not least, is the Chief Apothecary with the Selfless Healer trait, a Feel No Pain aura, healing injured models, and of course setting up one model for free each turn with his stratagem. I probably would have put him first to be honest, if he hadn't just been slapped by a hefty points increase in chapter approved. Which one of these really are the strongest though kind of depends on what chapter you're playing. Say armies like Salamanders are absolutely going to love their Eradicators and attack bikes, where White Scars players will certainly favour things like Blade Guard or Vanguard vets. I'm not going to talk through literally every Space Marine chapter, but I thought it could be quite interesting to talk through the ones that have quite a lot of their own unique datasheets and talk about the strongest of these. The Ultramarines have a ton of unique characters, maybe Tigurius might be one of the best value per point. He provides a couple of really reliable casts, and on top of that makes one unit -1 to hit each turn, which is a really nice defensive ability and is great to have in the centre of a battle line. Otherwise, Calgar and Guilliman are both really strong buffing characters, and the Ultramarines work particularly well with things like Incursors or Invicta Tactical Warsuits, being able to forward deploy them and then redeploy them with their pre-game stratagem if needed. For Blood Angels, I've still chosen to put Sanguinary Guard at the top spot, despite their 2-point nerf in chapter approved. I think they've just gone from ludicrously undercosted to still being an incredibly strong unit. They have enormously powerful melee with a flurry of high strength, high damage attacks, a 2+ armor save, a heroic intervention stratagem for annoying people on midfield objectives, yet a decent amount of shooting, and a -1 to hit in melee as if that weren't enough. A complete all-star unit here. I still expect them to be run a lot for the Blood Angels. Otherwise, Librarian Dreadnoughts are an interesting choice, being able to move quite so fast with Wings of Sanguinius can be very powerful. And the Sanguinary Priest with Jump Pack is certainly worth a mention. He can do everything that a Chief Apothecary does, put you one unit in the Assault Doctrine per turn, move very quickly with his Jump Pack, and also pack a hefty punch in melee, say if you give him something like the Teeth of Terror. Next we come to the Space Wolves. Well, I think that perhaps their strongest choice now is their standard Wolfguard datasheet, where they can take jump packs and lightning claws, and for some reason Games Workshop didn't increase these in line with Vanguard vets in the chapter approved. So if you want Space Marines with jump packs and lightning claws, Space Wolves now get the cheapest ones. Combined with +1 to hit, getting into the assault doctrine early, and all of the powerful melee boosts and stratagems the Space Wolves can get, I can see why they're quite so popular in Space Wolf competitive lists. Otherwise, Thunderwolves are quite nice for being durable with their Storm Shields and Advance and Charge. Beyond the Fell-Handed is a really efficient character Dreadnought, a bit of firepower, leadership and massive close combat threat, and Wolfguard Terminators can take some really interesting loadouts, combining things like cheap Lightning Claws and Storm Shields for an insanely tanky unit. The Dark Angels are kind of spoilt for choice, with the vast majority of their unique options being very strong indeed. For the top spot I chose to go with the Ravenwing Apothecary. Again, basically like a standard Chief Apothecary but much faster, and also can provide some other helpful tricks such as using a stasis grenade launcher to slow an enemy unit and make sure that they can't fall back from combat. Just being able to jump all over the back lines and set up things like attack bikes or Deathwing Terminators though is really powerful. Otherwise, Deathwing Terminators are enormously strong, only being able to be wounded on a 4+, combined with Storm Shields and 3 wounds means they're incredibly hard to kill. Ravenwing bikes and attack bikes need special mention because of their 5+ invul save, which can go to a 4+ with Jink. Both the Deathwing and the regular bike squads can also get Obsec as well. Ezekiel can bring some really handy psychic powers, such as turning off Obsec or preventing actions, and the Ravenwing can bring a bunch of interesting firepower in Talon Masters sitting back hidden from enemy shooting, or their unique flyers in the Nephilim and the Dark Talon. Can't really go too far wrong with Dark Angels, with lots of their different choices. For the Black Templars, their Chaplains and perhaps Chaplain Grimaldus might be one of the top choices. They can use their Litanies of the Devout to get a 5+ Feel No Pain, or other quite nice melee buffs, and Grimaldus himself also gives an exploding 6's aura for Black Templar melee units, stacking buffs upon buffs. Otherwise, the other Black Templar choices are pretty solid as well. Their unique characters are all usable, their Crusader squads are the cheapest Marine profile for the Space Marines at 15 points, and the Cenobite Servitors are worth a look as well. They can be a cheap unit to do actions and screen. Finally, for the unique Marine chapters, Deathwatch are struggling somewhat, but of their unique choices I think their veteran kill teams are probably the strongest. Enormously flexible gear, special issue ammunition, and basically the whole codex is built around supporting them. They can have some quite interesting builds with things like Combi Flamers and Storm Shields, and get right where they need to be with things like the Beacon and Jealous, or just teleporting into battle. The Spectres team is kind of interesting too. You can put down a bunch of Eliminators in a squad far bigger than they'd usually be able to be. You can get objectives secured on Outriders should you want to, and field them in bigger units. And I think that actually the Corvus Blackstar isn't too bad. It does compare fairly favourably with other Space Marine flyers, it just doesn't seem to have an enormous amount of synergy with the rest of the codex in my opinion. Moving out of the core codex Space Marines, we come to the Grey Knights, and my choice for them would be the Paladin squad, basically an enormous threatening unit with 3 wounds apiece, and perhaps the ideal place to stack all of Grey Knight's many buffing options to make them into a near enough unkillable unit with a crazy amount of damage output both shooting and fighting. They've got a stratagem to make themselves -1 damage, and if they cast a psychic power on them, then they can be -1 to wounds to enemy weapons. That combo alone means that very little is going to be efficient at killing them. They can also get further defense from Tides of the Warp, good mobility, teleporting around the board with Gate of Infinity, a fairly solid in melee with all of those force weapons plus maybe hammer hand and aura buffs, and they can even shoot fairly effectively as well if they use the Starbolt ammo stratagem. Other options for the Grey Knights include the slightly cheaper Terminators, only 2 wounds but they do get Obsec, Grandmaster Dread Knights for solid melee damage output and a bit of shooting, Strike Squads to drop all over the board, maybe apply a bit more of a multiple small unit approach, and I think that of the buffing characters, Caldor Drago is pretty solid, combining good melee power, fair survivability, full rerolls and his own psychic abilities. For the Custodes, I feel that they're fairly well balanced. Both their Forge World and Codex options are generally quite strong. The choice I went for in the end were Custodian Guard, because a big unit or 2 of these is rarely going to be a bad thing. A meaty close combat unit with a 1+ save and a 3+ invul, slogging up the board towards the midfield objectives and fighting off all comers. They're one of the most durable units in the entire game of 40k. There's really not all that much left that gets 3+ invul saves anymore. You kind of need them to help fill out detachments, and they can focus on holding down the midfield while the rest of the army gets stuck into the enemy. For the Custodes though, there's so much that I potentially could have chosen instead of them. I really like their unique Contemptor Dreadnoughts. The one with the Dread Spear deals an enormous amount of damage and the Galatas is really tanky. Shield captains on Dawn Eagle jet bikes can be ridiculously hard to remove. A 3+ invul, a 5+ feel no pain, and maybe even Victor of the Blood games can mean that you have a fighty character that can move really fast, and the enemy shooting is often just going to fail completely. Virtus Praetors and Ventari Custodians can provide fast-moving melee threats, jumping up the board and getting golden armor into combat very quickly, and there's plenty of rivals for the Custodian Guard on the battle line, the Tasitarum Custodians for the ranged bolt casters, very solid for holding backfield objectives, and both flavours of Terminators for built-in deep strike, some solid stratagems, and maybe even unleashing the lions. Next up we have the newly revamped Sisters of Battle, and I chose to go for Morven Val here, the new faction commander who just seems undercosted for what she does. Again, I made an entire video on Morven Val, so feel free to give her a search if you'd like, but she seems like a solid all-round boost to the army that it's almost impossible to go wrong with. Giving a core unit reroll all hits and wounds is ridiculously strong. She's a massive melee threat in her own right, and she can fight twice when she needs to in her hour of need. A small amount of quality shooting with some crack missiles and quality heavy bolter shots, and then she's not even all that easy to kill even if she is directly targetable, as she halves all incoming damage and also has a good invul. I think she's pretty much an auto-include territory for the Sisters now. Other very solid Sisters units are their two main melee threats, Repentia and Sacrosanct. Repentia just blend everything, perhaps even more efficiently than before now they went down in points. They will generally get rubbed out in return though, as they're really not all that tanky. Sacrosancts don't hit anywhere near as hard as Repentia, but then they'll be far more of a nuisance for the opponent to take down in return with their 2+ armor and 4+ invul saves. Dominions in Rhinos seem really quite fun now. You can pack a bunch of special weapons into the transport, move them up before the game begins, and potentially get some first turn Meltifier on the go. And I still really quite like the raw efficiency of Mortifiers. For their cost they do a really decent amount of damage both at range and in melee, and are pretty tanky for their 60-point cost with a 5+ feel no pain and 5 wounds. Next up we have the 9th edition incarnation of the Adeptus Mechanicus. I have chosen to go simple for this one with the god tier firepower that is the Iron Strider Ballistari. I genuinely think that currently these guys are the strongest shooting unit in all of Warhammer 40k, though particularly so at 48-inch range. For their points cost they just do far too much firepower, with twin Cognis las cannons doing d3+3 damage each, and their autocannons aren't bad either, spitting out a meaty 6 shots per walker. They're crazily mobile, they can move up to 16 inches and still fire to full effect with their stratagem, and they're also a core unit, allowing them to receive some very powerful buffs, such as reroll 1s to hit and wound from a 45-point marshal. On top of that, they aren't even all that easy to kill, particularly when they're in Bulwark Doctrine for an extra +1 to their saves, and they can potentially get even tougher in Forge Worlds such as Mars or Data Horde. Perhaps the other main contenders might be the Rangers and Vanguard, the core Skitarii units, both of which aren't enormously tough for the points, but spit out crazy amounts of firepower, the Rangers outshooting Space Marine intercessors laughably easily, and the Vanguard having a special stratagem meaning that a 20-man unit of them should average 30 wounds on literally anything that they target, provided it's not a vehicle. I really like the Archaeopter Fusilier as well, a cheap 130-point flyer that flies around bombing things with mortal wounds and blazing away with heavy stubbers, and has a few useful stratagems including auto-exploding, slowing down enemy units, or turning off auras, and perhaps some of their most undercosted buffing characters are the Skitarii Marshal, and perhaps Daedalosus from Blackstone Fortress, who does seem to still be part of the game. From Admech to Astra Militarum, and for the guard I chose the Manticore with the full payload rockets, perhaps one of the single strongest artillery units in the game, 2d6 shots at strength 10, AP -2 and flat damage 3. You potentially can get some rerolls with it, either with a Master of Ordnance for reroll 1s to hit, or maybe either with Kaschan or a Gunnery Experts regiment giving you rerolls of the number of shots. The profile's really nicely generalist, you're not going to particularly waste it firing against either heavies, heavy infantry or light infantry, and just being able to put those powerful rockets exactly where they're needed on the board means that you can address the single most important thing in your opponent's army. Other solid things include Demolisher tank commanders, by head and shoulders the most efficient damage dealing unit in the guard army, particularly if they use their Hail of Fire stratagem to get max 12 shots against a vehicle. Chimeras and to some extent Valkyries are really good transport units. In terms of the cost that you pay per wound and the heavy weapons that they bear, they're really good, just maybe slightly lack efficient things to transport. Infantry squads plus orders are always going to be helpful for the guard. They don't really do much in the way of damage, but just being able to move as fast as jet bikes with move means that you can put OBSEC where it needs to go. and Bulgrin are a fairly tanky, decent battle line unit that can get up to insane levels of durability if you cast Psychic Barrier on them and use the take cover stratagem. Though they're not really an army in their own right, I thought I'd talk briefly about the Imperial Agents, Inquisitors, Assassins, and a few other picks such as Mrs. Ephriel Stern. They can be included relatively freely in other armies thanks to the Agent of the Imperium special rule, and perhaps the most bang for the buck is the standard Inquisitor, providing a bunch of minor helpful buffs. Maybe his most useful psychic powers are being able to ignore Overwatch or casting a 5+ invul on one unit, and he can do a bit of command point farming with an Ordo Xenos Inquisitor. They also help the leadership of nearby units, and for their relatively cheap points cost, I think they're quite efficient. Otherwise, I'm quite a fan of Kotiaz, not so different from a standard Inquisitor, but packs a bit more of a hefty melee stat line and some interesting intercept abilities. Ephriel Stern got changed a bit in the new Sisters decks. She can now only be taken as an auxiliary support detachment for most armies, but for the points cost she now does really quite well as a fighty durable character. And finally, each of the Assassins I think still has its role within the army, though they are a bit of a luxury pick at 100 points. But I think that literally all of the Assassins are potentially usable, depending on what role you want them to fill. Calidus for CP manipulation and a bit of actual assassination on an enemy character. Vindicator gun down enemy characters at range. Eversors as some pop-up close combat to blend troops. And the Colexus if all you want is a bit more psychic defense and an annoying unit to remove. Finally for the Imperium we have the Titanic Walkers of the Imperial Knights, who I think certainly have another very obvious pick that towers above the rest in the Knight Questor Megaera. Compared with the other Codex and Forge World options, this is just ridiculously efficient. It's arguably one of the best both in shooting, melee and durability. At range, its Generalist Damage 3 Lightning Cannon also gets extra hits on 6s, and is going to be efficient against most things, particularly 3-wound infantry and vehicles. The Rad Cleanser with its hefty damage also can do some surprising work up close, and it gets Ignores cover hardwired into it. Its melee damage is absolutely spectacular as well, with 12 damage 3 attacks, potentially with rerolls if you're crassed, and it means that you really have to think hard about engaging this with virtually anything in melee, as you're going to be hit very hard back. Finally, in melee it also has a 5+ invul save, which is really powerful for the Imperial Knights, as they can use rotate ion shields in melee as well, meaning that you can have a 4+ save in combat, again making this thing very risky to charge. If you want a big knight, then this seems to be the way to go right now. Otherwise, I think that the Warden is one of the more solid choices out of the standard Questorist patterns. Armiger Warglaves are fairly cheap and dangerous now. 135 points isn't too bad for 12 wounds with a 5+ invul save, never mind their melter and melee damage, and the Armiger Moirax with its lightning locks is a fairly decent source of anti-infantry shooting at good range. Moving on from the Imperium into the realm of Chaos now, and we'll start out with the standard Chaos Space Marines. For the top spot, I've chosen the Chaos Terminators, which seem to be popping up in almost every Chaos Space Marine list now, with a nice pairing of Lightning Claws plus Combi Bolters, giving you a really efficient unit for 28 points. Depending on the strategy, some people tend to run Combi Plasmas instead of Combi Bolters, which can turn them into a pretty nasty shooting threat out of Deep Strike as well. And people often like to run them in Emperor's Children, to use Delightful Agonies on them for a 5+ Feel No Pain, Fighting First, and a bunch of helpful combat stratagems. They're a good unit for stacking a bunch of buffs on, which Chaos does well. Otherwise, you can think about their big synergy shooting units. Noise Marines or Obliterators can get to crazy levels of damage output, use a bunch of character buffs on them, and then use Endless Cacophony to fire the entire unit twice, and get twice as much firepower as you really should have. Dark Apostles and Sorcerers are good ways to get those buffs off, and if you go down a bit more of a Demon Engine focused strategy, you could think about things like the Master of Possession, Lord Discordant, and perhaps the new cheaper Venom Crawler. For the Diseased Forces of the Death Guard, I had a fairly hard time choosing the top spot, as they've got quite a lot of units that are very good for what they do. In the end, I went with a truly excellent chaff unit that is Poxwalkers, where being some of the cheapest models in the game for 5 points gets you far more than it really should do. Toughness 4, no save, and a 6+ Feel No Pain is actually really good durability for just 5 points, and ignoring morale on top of that is just gravy. That plus objectives secured is enough to justify them just in their own right. Having a tough unit of 10 of these sit on backfield objectives is absolutely fine. However, unlike most units like this, they can also be crazy damage output units as well. If you have a big unit of Harbinger's Poxwalkers charge into an enemy unit, activate their stratagem for reroll hits, and activate their stratagem for mortal wounds on hit rolls of a 6, and on average a 20 strong unit of Poxwalkers does something like a crazy 11 or 12 mortal wounds to whatever they've engaged in melee. It's truly crazy for 100 points of cheap tough chaff, You can easily wipe out entire squads of the enemy elite with this. Finally, if you're going really heavy on the Poxwalker strategy, then you can think about using the Terminus Est Assault Force. That adds a couple of other really good stratagems, including army-wide faster movement for them, and being able to regenerate injured squads of them. The Death Guard have a bunch of other good stuff going on though. Their Blight Lord and Death Shroud Terminators are both ridiculously tanky. The Blight Lords maybe if you want to emphasise the tankiness, the Death Shroud if you want some hefty melee damage too. Their support characters are really solid, particularly the Tallyman and the Noxious Blightbringer stand out. The Tallyman makes nearby units hit far harder, and the Blightbringer has his aura of fight last, plus his big Plague Spurt Flamer thing. Mortarion is still a massive pain to deal with for a lot of armies, very tough, kills virtually anything in melee, and provides a big aura of his Contagions of Nurgle. And the Plague Burst Crawler is a really efficient backfield tank, raining down a little bit of Ignore's line of sight firepower, and some hefty anti-tank fire with those entropy cannons. The Thousand Sons aren't having such a great time of it in 40k right now, and are desperately waiting for their new codex. One of the main things that they have going for them though is their powerful and flexible psychic phase, and if you want to cast psychic powers efficiently, then look no further than Ahriman. For his investment you get 3 casts at +1 to cast, so very good odds of getting off the spells that you need to, and he provides a bit of better psychic defense as well with his extra boost to denying. On top of that he also provides you with a reroll 1s to hit aura, and for a standard sorcerer he isn't really all that bad in terms of durability or his melee capability. For 170 points on a disc, he's a really efficient character. Otherwise, Magnus might be looking on a bit enviously at his brother Mortarion these days, but he still remains a very powerful threat on the table, and when he gets his durability buffs up, he's also very hard to remove. Can potentially work quite well alongside other big fast-moving chaos threats, maybe alongside Mortarion or some greater demons. Otherwise, for more psychic goodness, regular sorcerers are fine. Demon Princes give you more psychic and also a bit more hitting power, and maybe if you're building around a battle line unit, it will probably be Rubric Marines at the moment. They do have a fair few interesting options and stratagems. For the Chaos Demons? I was kind of struggling with which one to choose here. A few of their options have been somewhat nerfed lately. I decided to choose the Nurglings, again just as a unit that I think is almost always going to appear in Chaos Demon lists. They set up in the midfield, are fairly cheap and pretty tough to take out, particularly with small arms, due to their 5+ fail no pain save. They're pretty much guaranteed to annoy your opponent and steal some objectives, and potentially can be a good unit to nuisance charge enemy units and lock them up for a turn or two. The other unit that I was debating putting first will be the Exalted Lord of Change, who I'm just a touch less sold on due to going up 20 points in the latest chapter approved. I still suspect that he's going to be included in virtually any Chaos Demons list as well. He can combine a -1 damage trait with the Impossible Robe for a 3+ invul, making him a spectacularly hard model to kill. He can then blast out a bunch of mortal wounds with Infernal Gateway, be somewhat of a melee threat, and just generally be a good core of the army. Finally, Beasts of Nurgle are really tough for the points and have heroic intervention, making them good objective holders, and Exalted Keepers of Secrets have a lot of melee threat and can move very very quickly, potentially getting first turn charges and hitting the enemy with a bunch of high strength and damage attacks. Moving on to the Chaos Knights now, and I've chosen to rank the Armiger Moirax above the Questa Megara here, as the Moiraxes do seem to have been putting in quite a lot of work at high-performing Chaos lists. The reason they seem to be taken a bit more here is combining their Twin Lightning Lock loadout with their Infernal Knight's weapon overcharging trick. If you take a dedicated detachment for these Moiraxes, those Twin Lightning Locks will average 12 hits at Strength 6 AP -2 damage 1, and there's a trait for fall back and shoot, and getting extra AP when you're close to the enemy. They have the nice trick of being able to flex into extra damage output though. Each Moirax would take D3 mortal wounds, which is quite significant, but then one of their lightning locks jumps up to being an average of 6 hits at Strength 7, AP -2 and flat damage 2. Quite often that is going to be worth it when you're firing at the right enemy target, particularly things like 2 wound infantry that are quite expensive. Combine that with a few melee threats and you should be good to go. Otherwise, the already mentioned Questor Megara is another very strong choice for Chaos too. The Warglaive pattern War Dogs can be good. They get a lot of benefit from the Iconoclast household. Getting an extra attack and AP on the charge is great for them. And I also quite like the Twin Thermal Cannon Despoiler Knight. That's a lot of very efficient high strength anti-tank shots, but still some decent combat threat with its stomping feats. Finally we get to Xenos now, and we're starting out with the Craftworld Eldar. The best performing Craftworld lists seem to be very hefty on the Forge World things these days, and one unit that seems to be seeing play in virtually every list are the Hornets, a fast-moving Forge World skimmer craft with some mini pulse laser shots that are 4 shots at strength 7, AP -2 and flat damage 2. It's not awesome damage output, but it's not terrible either for their very cheap cost, and it works quite nicely with the expert crafters and masterful shots combo that's often run as a custom craft world. They're actually surprisingly durable for light vehicles, getting 8 wounds at toughness 6 and then -1 to hit, and their movement characteristic is just spectacularly fast, going a crazy 18 inches, so they're basically always going to have the exact shots that they want on the enemy, and are hopefully going to be able to stay hidden from a lot of the most powerful guns. Could be quite handy for jumping around the table, getting in table quarters, or contesting objectives if they need to sacrifice themselves. Otherwise, the Wraithseer with a D cannon is an interesting choice. Maybe not the toughest to kill, but a little bit of psychic, some powerful ignores line of sight shooting, and some strong melee are a nice combo. Dark Reapers, now they went down in points, look even more attractive. Again, very hefty damage output, ignoring all modifiers and using expert crafters and masterful shots. Farseers and Warlocks are kind of essential for making the Craftworld list work, amping up your own firepower, debuffing the opponent. And for another very powerful gun platform, the Forge World Lynx also seems to be seeing quite a lot of play in top lists. I'm wondering whether Wraithblades might now be powerful enough to really shine for the Eldar. They went down a bit in chapter approved, and maybe with all of the Craftworld synergies they might be able to be made work. Moving on to the Drukhari now. Again, a faction that's kind of spoilt for choice with very strong units. I've still chosen the Succubus as the top choice. Sure, she's lost the absolutely broken combo, the one that combines some weird combination of the Razor Flails and Competitive Edge to get theoretically up to 42 attacks, but for her 60 points, she still punches far harder than she has any real right to. For relics, you can take the Triptych Whip, usually 10 attacks wounding on 2s with AP -3 and damage 2, or Dark Lotus Razor Flails, where you get usually around 14 attacks at strength 4, AP -1 and damage 2 as well. Then combine that with either the Precision Blows Warlord trait, the one that gets you mortal wounds on any free hit roll of a 6, or Competitive Edge to be-roll all attacks that don't make it to the damage characteristic, take the extra +1 attack from combat drogs, and you have a character choice that's nearly guaranteed to justify its existence in a single round of combat. The amount of damage that you get out of 60 points and a Warlord trait and relic is just insane. If she's in the Cult of Strife as well, she can be quite handy to use Careful Approach. Ignoring Overwatch makes her really reliable, even on a fragile character. Otherwise, Drukhari really are overflowing with strong options. For melee damage dealers, we have Incubi or Witches, depending on whether you want a lot of strong attacks, or a ridiculous amount of fairly good attacks. Both Drazar and the Archon are both really efficient melee characters as well, even at Drazar's new points cost. Raiders make the entire Drukhari force work, even at their increased points cost of 95, they're still very solid with their 5+ Invul and their Dark Lance, and the fast attack choices such as Hellions and Reavers can traverse the board very quickly, do an eviscerating flyby for some mortal wounds, and then tie up something in combat. Next we come to the Harlequins, and I chose to rank their Skyweaver jetbikes first here. That's pretty much the heftiest Harlequin damage output unit that they can really get to work with their powerful buffs and stratagems. With Eldari jetbikes, they have spectacular movement, a reasonable amount of haywire shooting, and strong melee with those Zephyrglaives. Their stratagems can make them pretty unreasonable to fight against, such as falling back after fighting, getting extra damage on the charge, or being harder to kill after they lose a member of their squad, as well as all the character buffs that you can get as well within Harlequins. Otherwise, the standard troop with fusion blasters all packed into Starweavers are a good choice. In Soaring Spite, they can advance and shoot those pistols, getting them exactly where they need to be, usually within 3-inch melter range. The Shadowseer is a pretty essential character at the heart of the army, makes their units -1 to wounds, and also make them appear as if they're further away, foxing the enemy damage output. And Death Jesters are usually worth popping into a list as well. A few morale-related tricks is handy, but automatically turning off Overwatch is also great. For the Tyranids, following his very hefty points drop in chapter approved, I'd say that the Swarm Lord certainly has to be worth consideration in virtually every list. In competitive armies, he was basically played all the time anyway at 270 points, mainly because of that truly horrific double move ability where he directs a swarm or big critter nearby, gets it to move again, and potentially manages a first turn charge with any manner of nasty Tyranid threats. Of course, he's no slouch in melee himself whatsoever, and gets a 3+ invul save when he's there, and provides some psychic buffing abilities that are a good thing to have at the heart of the swarm. Maybe a touch on the fragile side to enemy shooting coming up range, so he does need to be a bit more carefully used than some units, but at least he should usually be able to protect himself quite well by being able to redeploy himself at the start of the game with his Warlord traits. Otherwise, Rippers are a nice cheap unit for popping up onto objectives and annoying enemies. The Exocrine can provide some really nice firepower and can now even fall back and shoot with its stratagem via the clarification to the big rulebook FAQ. Hiveguard are one of the most efficient ignores line of sight units in the entire game, and their weapons are quite generalist. Strength 8, AP -2 and damage D3 is going to do a lot of hurt, and they can fire twice with a stratagem as well. The Dimacaron isn't quite as gloriously efficient as it used to be. It did take a bit of a hefty nerf to counteract the Swarmlord going down, but still remains a very nasty Forge World critter, and I still think it's efficient for what you get. Finally, now Genestealers have dropped down to 13 points, we might see the Swarmlord catapulting them into combat once more. It'll be interesting to see if they start appearing in top NID lists. For the worshippers of the Four-Armed Emperor, the Genestealer Cults, I chose Acolyte Hybrids as the top spot. They just seem like the best unit to me to make good use of all of the Genestealer Cult tricks and tactics, providing pretty strong melee with their rending claws and mining weapons, and their great deployment shenanigans with Cult Ambush, allowing them to almost guarantee charges out of Deep Strike, or potentially even just set up very close to the enemy with a bunch of hand flamers and roast them off objectives. Their powerful melee can be buffed up a lot further by all the buffing characters available, maybe psychic powers like Might from Beyond, or extra accuracy from a Primus. Otherwise, maybe some of the other top picks might be the Achilles Ridge Runners. Their firepower can at least be somewhat good alongside a Jackal Alphas to make them hit on 3s. I think the Atalan Jackals are now far more worthy of a look after they went down to 12 points. Very cheap bikes with -1 to hit make for quite a good chaff unit now, and I think that Patriarchs will remain a very strong choice. Ignoring leadership is handy, and having just quite a powerful melee character is very nice, particularly when they can be very hard to kill due to cult members sacrificing themselves so their leaders won't die. Next we have the Deathless Forces of the Necrons, and I've chosen to rank their core Necron warriors top here. A very solid all-round troops choice, very hard to remove with resurrection protocols, and then have multiple ways to heal more models, such as Ghost Arcs, Technomancers, or Resurrection Orbs like the Orb of Eternity. Their damage output can be pretty nice as well with their close-range Gauss Reaper shooting, and they do have the tricks that they need to get them in range with that too, with piling out of Ghost Arcs, or porting across the board with the Veil of Darkness. A very solid troops choice, can be a real slog to chew through, particularly when protected by Chronomancer for a 5+ invul. The other units that could have easily put top for Necrons as well will be the Canoptek Scarabs, very cheap in points per wound, also work well with the Chronomancer, and have a handy heroic intervention stratagem to annoy enemies when they're trying to steal objectives from them, though I do admit that the new secondary objectives mean that they can give up points quite easily, if you take the one that gets you a point every time you remove a wound off a non-vehicle unit. The Silent King is also a staple in near enough every competitive Necron list, a massive centerboard threat that's quite hard to remove, a bit of powerful shooting, powerful buffs, and can really help you win the melee game as he'll make everything nearby him fight last. The Nightbringer is a threat that can remove virtually anything on the board, certainly going to be intimidating to anyone facing off against it, and for the HQs the Chronomancer I think is really efficient, making your units nice and tough and also chipping away with a massive D3+3 damage shot. Next we have the Tau Empire, where I've chosen to rank the Farside Enclave Crisis Bodyguard unit as the top choice. You can take these Crisis Bodyguards in really big squads, so they're good for getting the absolute maximum of synergy out of them, then give them all a 3+ to hit with the Veteran Carder stratagem, and combine that with all the rerolls that you get for being Farside Enclaves when you're up close and personal to the enemy. Now Games Workshop has absolutely clarified how Montcar works, and it does mean that you can definitely fall back and shoot for no penalty. It means that this unit can be far more aggressive than before, and isn't at risk of having its entire firepower ruined just because someone manages to make contact with it. Their damage output can be very solid indeed, and they can also be reasonably durable between nearby drones, Iridium battlesuits, and the reactive countermeasures option that you can put on a battlesuit with the airbursting fragmentation projector. Otherwise, the current staples in the top tower lists tend to be things like Riptides with amplified ion accelerators. A big auto 6 shots and a D3+3 damage makes one very efficient as an include. I don't think many lists wouldn't be running one of these. Breaches and Devilfish seem to be the go-to way to secure midfield objectives. A bit of nice obsec and reasonable close range shooting. Commander Farsight is really powerful, being able to use Montcar twice and keep those battlesuits firing away, and the Cold Star Battlesuit Commander with its insane movement can be used as a bit of a surgical scalpel tool to apply some firepower just when it's needed, even if he is a bit fragile. Last but not least, we come to the Orks, and the unit that I've chosen for first place is the Warbottom Warbag, in particular the loadout with Daemonic Claw and Brutal but Cunning. This combo just makes him a great kill everything threat in close combat, no penalty to hit, a bunch of rerolls, and a flat damage 3 with that Power Claw. Add that to his enormous threat range where he can advance and charge, and he's a great character to have in the centre of an Ork army, particularly in a vehicle one where he can make nearby vehicles advance and charge too. Otherwise, the basic boys are certainly worth a mention. Big units of 30 can put out mountains of strength 4 attacks, and can get where they need to be via a weird boy with da jump. Smasher guns provide some solid Gretchen related firepower. The burner bomber can potentially nuke the heart of an enemy army turn 1 by hitting a bunch of units with its auto-explode stratagem. Ghazghkull Thraka is really quite good for leading an Ork Goth horde, extra attacks for nearby boys, and of course he'll be tricky to deal with just in himself. He doesn't take more than 4 wounds damage per phase. Megatrak Scrapjets have been seeing a lot of play, particularly with Death Skulls. They provide a decent amount of rocket attacks, can fight twice with their Corkscrew custom job, and the Death Skull rerolls help them out enormously with both of these. Finally, for snagging some objectives, small units of Death Skull commandos seem to be all the rage, automatically deep striking, and then they have objectives secured with the Death Skull's trait, meaning they can be a nice option for taking some objectives away from the enemy. So I hope you've enjoyed a bit of a chat through the various different armies of 40k, and what I think might be some of the strongest units for each one. If there's any units that I've underrated, or maybe should have picked for the top spot, please let me know down in the comments. I'm always keen to learn more about the various factions. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep these regular 40k videos coming, with new content coming out pretty much every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention the Auspex Tactics Patreon page, which is how I can afford to make quite so many videos quite so often. Making daily videos does take an enormous amount of time, and if you are enjoying regularly, any support is greatly appreciated. I do try and give as many rewards as I can for being a Patreon of the channel. You get to see regular videos early, there's votes every month or so about what sort of videos you want to see next on the channel, and you get automatic entry to the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some very big model kits every month. If any of that sounds good, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.